Jovan Buha! Buha!
Yo, welcome to another Lakers postgame reaction show. I'm Jovan Buha, Lakers beat writer for The Athletic. It was one of those nights for the Lakers. They fell 116 to 102. Just got back from the Intuit Dome. And typically I write after my streams. Tonight I was writing with a coworker, Law Murray. So we ended up writing, went a little bit later than expected. So I appreciate the patience here. And I appreciate you all in the chat, late night gang. And yeah, I mean, the Lakers did not have it tonight, clearly, and neither did I with that intro. But shout out to everyone who is populating and commenting right now. So a lot to get into. You guys know the drill. Before we get started, please be sure to subscribe, turn on channel notifications, and like and comment on this video. And for those listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcast platform of choice, please be sure to follow, download, and leave a 5-star review. So let's just get into it, right? So Lakers fall 116 to 102. They drop to 22 and 18. They are now number 6 in the West. They entered the game number 6 in the West, but they are firmly entrenched. They had the possibility to jump to number 5 had they beaten the Clippers. I don't know the current Lakers-Clippers record since 2011, but it's not good for the Lakers. This continues the Clippers' domination of them over the past 14 years or so. This was the first game at the Intuit Dome. I will say it is an incredible arena, and what was a really cool experience walking around and soaking it all in. But from the Lakers' perspective, this was another loss to an above 500 team and another loss to a team better than them. And those are two things I'll be touching on in my takeaways. But really, the thing to me was some of the post-game comments, particularly from JJ Redick and LeBron James, and just the concerning nature of some of the things that they were saying and things that you don't want to be hearing about a team or from a team about themselves at the 40-game mark of the season. So tonight, the overarching takeaway for me is going to be this was just another concerning loss against a good team. And I know that the final score was 14 points, but the Clippers were really leading this game basically wire to wire, and it felt like they were fully in charge from the first few minutes. And now, like I'm going to spoil one of my takeaways, but the Lakers are 11-17 against teams 500 or above, which is the worst record among the 10 teams in the playoffs or play-in in the Western Conference. They have the 4th worst net rating and point differential in the conference. They're also now 2-7 against teams with a better record than them, with the 2 wins coming against Memphis. But remember, one of those games, there was no Ja, no Desmond Bane. So it's just like there's certainly been some highs this season. You can point to the play of LeBron and AD, the recent emergence of Austin. He's averaging 20-7 since the DFS/D'Lo trade. There's been some signature wins, but the statistical profile having them having a negative net rating and a negative point differential, them being 6 games under 500 against above 500 teams, and them being 2-7 against teams with a better record than them. You combine that all, and it's a troubling profile in terms of viewing them as a legitimate contender. Like I think there's been very few signs that this current group is capable of contending. And that could change if they make the right trade or the right couple of trades. But as currently constructed, if this group just stands pat and doesn't do anything else, or does like a small move, a 2nd round pick, a couple 2nd round picks, like that's not moving the needle enough. And now we're at the 40-game mark. We something sometimes about big round hole numbers, like you kind of gain some perspective. And I just think at this point, 4-5 since the DFS trade, again, that 11-17 record and the 2-7 record really stand out to me. So that right now is kind of the thing on my mind of just like the Lakers don't have, they certainly have some signature wins throughout the course of the season, but they don't have a lot of good wins against good to really good teams. And that, I think, halfway through the season is a bit concerning, and I might be underselling it, to be honest. Stat of the night, I'm really not going to focus too much on the game. I think from this point on, it's going to be some bigger picture topics, but stat of the night for me was 8 offensive rebounds for Ivica Zubac. Overall, he had 21 points and 19 rebounds, including 8 offensive. And there are very few games this season where I think Anthony Davis has been outplayed by an opposing center. Tonight was one of them. And I thought Ivica Zubac thoroughly outplayed him. He was more physical with him. And it's interesting because there's obviously been that narrative that AD doesn't play well against European centers. And you could point to Jokic, you could point to Sabonis. And I thought AD played fairly well against Jokic earlier this season. I also think until, obviously like first half and then the third quarter just went off the rails. And then against Sabonis, I thought he outplayed him, and the Lakers swept the Kings this season. So it felt like he had kind of quieted that narrative a little bit, but tonight sort of brought back some of the demons of the past to me. And it wasn't just AD, because I do think when the Lakers went small or when smaller guys are switched on to him, he just pummeled them in the paint. I also think he had like 3 or 4 blocks, blocked Rui a couple times, and Rui matched up with him and had a couple of nice defensive possessions, but he scored on Rui. He was getting offensive rebounds, and he really punished the Lakers in a way that I think it was like as thorough of a punishing as they've had all season from a center off the top of my head. Like, Steven Adams comes to mind, of course, in Houston, but that was in limited minutes. Like, I just thought Zubac, that was one of the best center performances against the Lakers this season. And again, I think AD has largely been their best player, their most consistent player. He's played at an all-star, all-NBA level basically all year. But tonight, I think Zubac pretty thoroughly outplayed him, to be honest. Then takeaway number 1 for me, we're going to have to touch on these post-game comments because it was pretty alarming. So first thing, we speak with JJ Redick, and he essentially, to paraphrase the essence of what he was saying, was that he was talking a lot about growth and this group still learning each other and figuring out their identity. And I didn't love that for a group that's 40 games in. And yes, they just made a trade 9 games ago, but it feels like they should be further along in that process. And it does feel like that's kind of been a talking point for them. Anytime they lose to a good team or an important game, it's kind of like, well, we're just learning, we're growing. So I didn't love that. But then he had a comment kind of buried in. So he got asked, basically, you guys had this stretch of a homestand where in theory it was supposed to be a bit easier. You weren't going to be traveling. You're playing some easier teams, and you guys are below 500 over this stretch. Does it feel like you squandered that opportunity? And then he kind of talked about some of the learning and the growing, but he also had a line in there about realizing early in the season that things were not going to be easy for this group. And that kind of raised the antennas a little bit. And then he was asked a follow-up question of like, and not having much margin for error. And then he was asked a follow-up question, like, how can you create that margin for error? And he basically said, like, we can't. It's not something that can be created organically. We have to just try to play the best we can. But there was kind of an implication that this group has certain limitations, and JJ was acknowledging those limitations. Then you have LeBron go, and he gets asked about JJ's comments about the margin for error, which has been a trend for this group in terms of bringing up no margin for error. We have to play near perfect basketball. And LeBron essentially says, we're not constructed that way. Or I want to be fair to him. I will quote him directly. So he gets asked, can you give yourself more on the margin? Are there things to make it easier? And he says, nah, that's how our team is constructed. We don't have room for error, dash for much error. And then he gets asked, what are the mental demands? It's a follow-up. What are the mental demands of having to play close to perfect basketball? And he says, we don't have a choice. I mean, that's the way our team is constructed, and we have to play close to perfect basketball. And so those comments in conjunction with one another really raise some antennas of JJ and LeBron basically speaking to the limitations of this group, and the subtext there just being this roster isn't good enough and some trades and moves need to be made in addition to what already happened with the DFS trade. And I think for everyone watching right now and listening, I think you all know this. I know this. It's something I've talked about countless times on here. But to hear the two most prominent public voices that speak consistently, because of course Rob and Jeannie would theoretically be the two most prominent voices of the organization, but like the two most prominent voices that speak consistently, JJ and LeBron, both speak to this. I thought was very interesting. It was something you don't see all the time. And again, I don't want to overblow it. And it wasn't like LeBron was like, oh, this team sucks and we need new players. But again, saying the way that this team is constructed, we have to play basically perfect basketball to beat good teams. If someone has a different read on those comments, I'd love to hear it. And I would entertain it, but I don't see how you read those comments as anything other than saying the roster isn't good enough, and for us to really have a shot, the roster needs to get better. And again, I think this is something we know, and it had been trending towards something of this sort being said publicly, but it was kind of just waiting for that shoe to drop. It dropped, and I thought it was just really interesting timing of having a big group of LA media there because it was a Clippers game. So you had all the Lakers media, definitely more media than normal. So it's maybe going to get a little bit more attention. Like I'm not quite sure. Like maybe it was just losing to the Clippers again and that rubbing them the wrong way. Like I'm not sure what, or maybe they just had enough and it's just a coincidence of like the timing and the context and the situation. But I thought that was really interesting that both of them said that in the way that they did. And to me, I try not to, I don't like to overblow things, and a lot of times, sometimes like post-game comments can be taken out of context or can be misrepresented or whatever. But I felt those two, comments from both of them, like they were asked follow-up questions and they doubled down on their original points. So I don't really see how you can take it any other way. And now what that means over the next 2.5 weeks as the Lakers decide on the future of the roster, we shall see, right? And I will continue to report and cover on that. But the fact that you had JJ and LeBron come out and take not so subtle digs at the roster or their ability to really compete on a nightly basis, that to me was a bit alarming. Takeaway number 2 for me, and I try to find sometimes the positives in losses and like what's like the one thing I think the Lakers can take and translate into future games. And to me tonight, it was the Jackson AD minutes. And this is something that JJ has talked about, obviously, with the two big lineups and trying to test those out a little bit more and play them more. And he goes to Jackson, LeBron, AD, believe it was Dalton and Gabe as the other backcourt guys. And that 5-man lineup helps the Lakers go on that 13-2 run to close out the third quarter. And earlier in the game, he had gone to a lineup I didn't like as much because it was AD, Jackson, Dorian, Max, and Gabe. And in theory, you're trying to be more disruptive defensively, but I didn't feel like they had enough offense. And really, if you looked at the way that the Clippers were guarding them, AD was the only guy that they were worried about in that lineup. So I think if they're going two bigs, especially with the spacing concerns of having AD and Jackson next to each other, you need to put the other three guys as guys who can shoot. And yes, in theory, Dorian, Gabe, and Max are all plus shooters, especially with the way Gabe's been shooting it lately. But those guys are more finishers and connectors than creators and initiators. So I think when the Lakers go two bigs, it's really important to have LeBron or Austin on the floor. And I think we saw that in that later shift where they went on the run. They cut the Clippers got it to 26 late in the third quarter. LA got it down to 15. Actually had it down to 13, and then Clippers scored, and then Lakers, but got it to 15 entering the fourth. And a big part of that was the two big look. And they're throwing in some zone, some 2-3 zone. I didn't love it. I felt they were a little too, again, one thing I've talked about with their defense is sometimes they could be a bit too reactive and not proactive and not really dictate the terms. And I felt that was kind of an issue with the zone. But having Jackson out there and even having LeBron at the three, you saw AD blocked Zubac. They hit a few jumpers. The spacing was fine. Jackson got a lob. So I think moving forward, now ideally, as I think we know, like you rather have a better center than Jackson in there, a guy who can either space the floor or defend the rim better than him, because he kind of is in no man's land in terms of he's not a floor spacer, but he's also not a rim protector. And I think if you're going to put another big next to AD, it has to be one of the two. It has to be a guy either complimenting him offensively or complimenting him defensively. I don't think Jackson necessarily does that other than just being like a big athletic body. But even then, Zoo scored on him a few times. Like they were attacking him at the rim. It's just like, I think good offenses look at Jackson as a guy that they can attack and score over or draw fouls against. So there's like an amplification of putting him next to AD. You are going to have like a baseline level of size and defense and whatnot. But I would say like this is starting to look like a little bit of a testing for what this group could look like with a better big man next to AD. And I think JJ is obviously experimenting with the other pieces around them. And I think one of the lessons has to be, it's got to be Austin or LeBron in one of the other three spots. And really, why not? Like, I would like to see Austin, Max, LeBron, Austin, Dorian, LeBron, Austin, Rui, LeBron, something like that, where you could kind of rotate the fifth guy, but you have Austin and LeBron out there creating, and they can hit AD or Jackson as the roll man in the pocket. They could find them for lobs. They could find them for dump off passes to the dunker spot. And they can just basically squeeze everything they can offensively out of that group. And then defensively, you have the protection of a giant front line with LeBron, AD, and Jackson. And those lineups, were solid last season. So I would say that the biggest positive for me from this game, and just the biggest positive, I guess, overall, the last few days / couple games, has been the reintegration of the two big lineups and the way that they've looked. And again, I think it's important. It's not just going too big to go too big, but it is it's about finding the right combinations. And I still don't love like these very defensive minded lineups that JJ goes to sometimes, because I don't think they're quite good enough defensively, and they're just not good offensively. So I feel like they just kind of end up being bad lineups. And that's something that I think he continues to kind of do that I don't really agree with. Like, I don't think Austin or LeBron can afford to be off the floor, or the Lakers can afford to have either one of those guys off the floor with the current ball handlers, scorers, shooters that they have on this roster. Like, the offensive drop off to Gabe Vincent, Max Christie, Shake Milton, whoever's running the offense, co-opting it next to AD. It's just such a stark drop off that I don't think I don't think they can afford to do it. I think they have to stagger LeBron and Austin all times. But to bring it back to the two big lineup, I thought that they had a bit of a breakthrough there in the third quarter. They did go to it again a little bit in the fourth. And even in general, I liked that they went to that lineup of Austin, Dorian, Rui, LeBron, and AD and just got super funky. And you can see that lineup potentially working with Vando in Rui's spot or Vando in DFS's spot. Or Max. I mean, Max in there is obviously a little bit more conventional. You're basically the starting lineup. And they did go to that lineup with DFS in Rui's spot again. But I think we're starting to see that, and it's not necessarily a surprise, but I do think this team plays better, bigger. It goes back to last season, similar thing. They play better, bigger. And it is somewhat context-based. It is somewhat matchup-based. So I don't want to say it's going to work against every opponent, but it did work against the Clippers. And Jackson and AD were +1 in their 9 minutes together. And it doesn't sound great, and it's not. But when you look at the Lakers losing by 14, that means they were -15 in the other 39 minutes without two centers together. So that's just kind of a smaller thing that I feel like is something that, is a positive to take away from this game. And then the third and final takeaway, this one's going to be brief, but I think the Lakers really need to figure out what type of team they want to be. And this is kind of part of the overarching thought in like first takeaway, but it feels like they want to be like this defensive slug it out team, but I just don't think they have the personnel to do that. I think their personnel trends far more offensively. And if you look at their best games this season, they've tended to be higher scoring offensive games, at least on the Lakers side. And of course, when you're making shots, you're going to look better. And like there's an element of that for sure. But I still think the best player, like if we're ranking the best players on this team, I think the better defenders are a little bit lower on that list, and the better offensive players are a bit higher on the list. And there's just some limitations to certain combinations. Like I've talked about LeBron, Rui, and Austin together. I think that is a limiting combination defensively. And as long as that continues to start and play a certain amount of minutes, I think the Lakers starting lineup defense is going to be bad. And that's why I've been advocating for DFS to start in Rui's spot. But I mean, if that's going to be the lineup for the foreseeable future, like I almost think you just got to lean more offensive, right? And that potentially informs like what they do at the deadline. But I feel like right now they are going through this transformation of like, what team do they want to be? Because again, since adding DFS, they're now 4-5, and they've been pretty good offensively and horrible defensively. And it was supposed to almost be the inverse of like losing D'Lo, not having that extra creator, playmaker, shooter, adding a guy who's more of an off-ball, threat, and then is a much better defender and bigger and whatnot. Like that was supposed to help the defense, and maybe the offense took a step back, but it's been the opposite. The offense has been better. The defense has been worse. And part of that's been like Austin's really stepped up as the number 3 guy. He's averaging 20 points, 7 assists on really good shooting. And I think he stepped up as a credible number 3 option, but it feels like the Lakers need like a better grasp on like what their identity is. Cause even tonight there was a couple of identity questions, and it's sort of like, well, we got to be like our identity is being connected. And like, that's not an identity. Like the Clippers, for example, as a contrast, like, what their identity is. They're running a lot of pick and roll with James Harden and Ivica Zubac. Kawhi is going to be isoing or posting up. They're going to they're running some off-ball action for him in the third quarter. And everyone else is kind of just filling the gaps offensively. Like Norm Powell is a big piece. But like there's kind of a hierarchy, that there's a clearer identity offensively. And then defensively, it's basically switch everything. And like in some ways they kind of play the way that I think JJ wants the Lakers to play. The difference is they have far more athletic two-way players than the Lakers do, and a better combination of guys who can both fill it up and defend multiple positions. So I think there was a clear identity and through line for the Clippers. The Lakers are like night to night, a completely different team in just the context of like some nights they're good offensively and bad defensively. Some nights they're bad offensively, good defensively. Some nights they're bad on both sides. Some nights they're good on both sides, but those are rare. So it's like, I just think that there needs to be another kind of recalibration of who this team is, what they want to be moving forward, and then really leaning into that identity, that style, those lineups, that rotation, etc. Because it feels like, again, they're really grasping, and even when pressed on the question, I don't feel like they're giving great answers as to like what this team, because, and some people have even said, I think AD's spoken to, like, he thinks they're an elite defensive team, and they've had flashes. And I've said, like, they've surpassed my defensive expectations for stretches, but overall in the season, they've not been a good defense. For several stretches of the season, they've been a bottom 5 defense. And in retrospect, it kind of looks like in some instances they've been able to just beat up on bad teams and pad some of their defensive numbers that way. And against good teams, they're just not been that good, especially on the defensive end. So I know I just said a lot. We got off to the rough start with the intro, but felt like I got in a better flow there. With all that said, let's get into the Q&A. See, we got some super chats. First one from Braden. Hey, Jovan, games like these make me question if we should really trade the picks or just keep them for the rebuild. I agree. I was Mr. Optimistic on the Lakers entering the season. I felt like I was on an island at times, at least from like a national perspective of whenever I would do interviews or whatever. I would say like, hey, I think this is a group that could be a 5 seed, could maybe even be a 4 seed if everything breaks right. And look, they're still technically the 6 seed. They're right there. They're not that far, but it does, like, that being the only team in the top 10 with a negative point differential and a negative net rating, that's concerning. Those are 2 considerable marks that are harbingers for what, like, how you're going to perform later in the season. And really, when it comes down to it, is like they don't have a lot of blowout wins. They barely beat the Nets and some of these types of teams, and then they get their asses kicked by the elite teams. And like, that's a troubling formula. Like, that there's really no way around it. So I agree with you. A night like tonight, I'm kind of like, okay, put Walker Kessler out there. Like, do they still win the game? Or do they win the game in that case? Like I actually thought Rui, I think, had 19-7. I have the box score right here. Yeah, Rui had 19-7. He had a really slow start to the game. He did a lot more of his damage in terms of rebounding and scoring in the second half. But like, all things considered, I thought Rui actually had a decent game. Off-ball defense continues to be an issue. Backdoor cuts, losing guys off the ball, losing guys on driving kicks. That's just like, that's kind of baked into his deficiencies and limitations. That's also, again, why I think the Lakers ultimately need to move away from the LeBron, AD, Rui front court, at least as a starting look. But I thought Rui actually played a decent game. And like, if you swap someone else in for him, maybe it's a closer game. But the way they got exposed on both sides of the ball tonight, it's hard to make the case for them to invest in this group, to be honest. Although I also agree with JJ and LeBron that there are clear deficiencies with this roster, and anyone saying that like this is a complete roster or this is a good enough roster to contend, I don't think that's a fair representation of what the first 40 games have looked like. So I do see it both ways. I still lean more toward just go for it and try to get the best players possible for those picks. But you could make a strong counter argument that based on the net rating, based on the point differential, based on the record against teams above 500, that it's not worth investing in this group. And that's where I'm fascinated to see how the next 2.5 weeks go. Flying Rajin Dex. Hey, Jovan, if the Lakers can land Bruce Brown and Robert Williams, do you think they get better? Yes, I do. Those are two of my favorite trade targets. I've teased this. I'm going to be, so the plan this week quickly, content-wise, of course, post-game reactions to every game. But during the week, tomorrow, I'm going to be doing State of the Lakers, which is my storylines check-in every 10 games. So I will have, might not do all 10 storylines, we'll see, but storylines checking in at the 40-game mark, and specifically what have been the storylines from game 31 to game 40. And that will include the DFS trade as that happened right there at the 31-game mark. And then Wednesday, I'm going to be doing mid-season report card. So I'm going to have Dan Wojcicki of the LA Times on, and I'm going to present to him my mid-season grades for the Lakers roster and JJ Redick. And then we're going to debate and sort of analyze those grades and what he thinks of them. We were each going to do our own grades, but then we decided that they're probably going to be too similar. So I'm going to surprise him, and then we're going to debate them. But I say all that to say, then the following week, I'm going to be doing my top 10 trade targets, and both of these guys are going to be on that list. I would assume they're both probably going to be top 5, if not at least top 7. But Bruce Brown is high atop the list, and I've been watching Bruce Brown film in Toronto, and I've been really impressed with what I've seen on film. He's had a couple of nice dunks in traffic. I think he is constantly moving, and that's something that the Lakers need offensively, is guys not just standing around, but Bruce Brown is constantly cutting, screening, flashing. And I know with like Dorian, for example, when he first came to the team, that there were some times he was running into guys and he had to kind of learn the Lakers offense, which is sometimes just stand around and watch LeBron, Austin, or AD do something. And it's something they can work on. But I think Bruce Brown, like he's got the ability to initiate offense, bring the ball up the floor, dribble and attack in transition. He's really good at inverted screens, which is basically when he screens for a bigger player. So he could screen for LeBron, he could screen for AD. He's a really good roller, and then he could also hit people out of the short roll. And again, he can do the baseline cutting that Rui does. Obviously, he's 6'4", he's not 6'8". So he's not going to necessarily finish the same way that Rui does, but he has. I've seen some dunks off of baseline cuts, and he's really crafty around the rim in terms of not exposing the ball and finishing over bigger players. He's also got a nice little floater game and can attack closeouts and finish with that. So certainly some flaws to his game. I think the size, the shooting, the injury history, like those are not, those are all significant and notable flaws, but I do really like, the more I've watched him and what his strengths are, I just think he's a very versatile player that you could use on multiple spots of the floor. He's very skilled. He's got the big game, deep playoff experience with Denver. And he also is someone who I think, depending on the price, you might be able to get at a slight bargain because of the knee injury, because he's been with Indiana and Toronto in essentially basketball Siberia. And he's not as coveted as he was coming off that 2023 title run. But I think it might be a chance for a buy low opportunity with Bruce Brown. Robert Williams, I haven't dug into his film as much yet, but he's explosive. He's one of the best shot blocker rim protectors in the league over the last few years. And he's a lob threat, offensive rebound threat. So he's a better version of Jackson Hayes, and a legitimate rim protector, shot blocker. I think he would be a much better fit next to AD. Then next one from Shabugan, Rob, in a month. Guys, we really tried to get trades done, but there was no value in the market. By the way, our new gamified training app is done. I like the callback to the app. I've not heard anything of note on that since it was mentioned. The one thing I will say and I have made this point, and this is like the one note I will make in the Lakers defense, is I do think based on like who's currently available, it's not like there's a list of 10 to 15 guys that I think are worth like a first or two firsts. And the Lakers have like all these options to pick from. And it just ultimately might come down to them like not wanting to invest or give up a first. Like, I think if you really look at it, like of the projected guys that are supposed to be available, it's like Cam Johnson and Walker Kessler in terms of like guys worth a first. I think everyone else is basically worth like 2 to 3 seconds tops. And then, of course, you have the star tier, but matching salary for Zach LaVine, Jimmy Butler, Brandon Ingram, De'Aaron Fox, like that's really difficult for the Lakers since they traded D'Lo and don't have the nearly 19 million in salary that he brought. So there are scenarios, of course, that they can get to that money, but if any of those include Vando, that's not going to be appealing for opposing teams. And the Lakers ultimately only have 2 picks in a few swaps and 2 seconds that aren't that valuable. So from like, if there's an arms race for De'Aaron Fox, or Jimmy, the offers haven't been great. BI, his value is relatively low. Zach LaVine also relatively low. So like maybe those 2 guys are a little bit more realistic for what the Lakers have. But I also think like I would say Jimmy and De'Aaron are the 2 best players that we're talking about here among the 4. So there's a reason why BI and Zach LaVine don't really have a big market right now. So that's the only thing. Now, could you go get Cam Johnson? Could you go get Walker Kessler? Or could you just go get, overpay for someone maybe? And it's not necessarily the best use of your assets, but you're getting the best player possible for the stuff you're willing to trade. That's where I fall in terms of, I agree that like it's not the best market. Again, it's not like there's all these game-changing options out there. But if you get creative and you are willing to use a first-round pick, you will get better. Like, is it an overpay? Is it like incrementally better versus like significantly better? Sure, but I think the Lakers should be in the mode of we're not good enough. We need to get better, and that's where again. I mean, Walker Kessler continues to be my number 1 target, but if you could still get Cam Johnson for potentially anything under 2 first-round picks, I would certainly be interested in getting Cam Johnson. Eeg, thank you for the super chat. Adding DFS and subtracting D'Lo is only useful if that's the precursor for another move for a ball handler scorer. Rob Bueller. One of my favorite movies of all time is Ferris Bueller's Day Off. I actually just watched it with my son, so that is and he enjoyed it. That is an aside. Yes, I agree, and I'm writing about this. I have a column coming out on Tuesday about the Lakers and the different paths they can take, and sort of the logic in each direction. And the DFS trade was nice. I supported that. I complimented it. I think it was a shrewd move, not giving up a first-round pick when this is a guy that at one point was valued at 2 first-round picks. Then that eventually went down to 1. Then it ultimately went down to 3 seconds. And I thought it made a lot of sense. Austin has really stepped up since then. I do agree with you that I think they could use another ball handler, playmaker. I don't know if they necessarily need another scorer, but that could be a luxury that they add, and maybe like, I'm not quite sure who that player is, but maybe they find that player and add them. But I think the bigger picture thing is just, if it's February 7th and I'm here talking to you guys, and the biggest move that they made was adding DFS, this roster is almost certainly just not going to be good enough. And I would also suspect that if DFS is the biggest player that they added, it's because they did not put those 2 first-round picks on the table, or they ultimately did not execute a deal with those 2 first-round picks. And if that's the case, or at least one of the 2, if that's the case, then it's just hard to say that they really believed in this group and went all in. Like, it's just as simple as that. That's the way I view it. That's the way I'm operating. They either make the move or they don't. And if they don't, I think that tells you what they ultimately thought. Because again, with such a relatively limited market and only so many first round picks theoretically available, with I think teams being a little bit more cautious in terms of giving up first round draft capital for some of these guys. If they're not willing to be more aggressive and potentially slightly overpay just to try and put the best roster possible around LeBron and AD, I do think that's just a sign that ultimately they didn't really think this group could do it. And that's okay if they think that, because maybe they're right. Again, based on that rating, point differential, record against good teams, all that stuff. But I think then the framing ideally would be congruent with that in terms of saying that. I don't think that would ever be said publicly, but I think if it ends up turning into an excuse of the player wasn't there, or there was nothing that was worth our first round pick, I don't think that's going to hold much water with most of the fan base. Shabugan again, is AD more injured than they're letting on? He doesn't look the same as he did early in the season. I do think this foot injury is affecting him. It seems to kind of go and come in waves. We asked him post game how he was feeling. He said he was feeling all right. There was like a little hesitation in his answer, and I do think it's something that he's playing through. He hasn't been as mobile, because remember the start that he had to the season, and then the Detroit game. It was still relatively early in the season. I want to say it was like game 7 or something. But from that point on, I do think you've seen a decrease in mobility, and he hasn't been quite the same physically. And he certainly had good stretches. And even with those limitations, he has still produced at, again, all-star, all-NBA level. But he hasn't quite been at the level he was at the very beginning of the season. And I do think part of that is just the foot. And it's just one of those things that the only way it's going to heal is if he's off of it. And the Lakers cannot afford for AD to be off of his foot. So maybe they can selectively pick games for him to rest. And like the Nets game almost ended up being a disaster if D'Lo hits that shot, but they survived, they escaped, and maybe there'll be more games like that in the future. But I do agree that like I don't want to use it as an excuse for AD, but I do think he has not quite looked the same. But I think it's just the reality of the injury he's dealing with and just the way it's going to be moving forward. Eag 1-8 in the last 9 playoff games. All there is to show is a DFS swap for D'Lo, atrocious front office, failed promises, continuity in 23 offseason, then big splash for 24 offseason during 24 decline, which had 0 moves. Super chat to follow. Eag, now no first on table. Is this a joke? Front office is straight up gaslighting the fan base. You have a GOAT and a top 10 player, enough with valuing the future. This is clearly, quote, I value my job security and will not take another risk, end quote. Well, thank you for the very generous super chats, Eag. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to disagree with anything you said. Like, I think there has been a bit of like kicking the can down the road with this whole situation. And I've talked about it. I'm writing about it. Like, they sat out 3 trade cycles. They sat out the 2023 offseason. They sat out the 2024 deadline. They sat out the 2024 offseason. And they, in a way, and I've made this point before, but I continue to think this, and I feel like with more distance, it's almost cemented in my head more and more, is I kind of feel like the 2023 Western Conference Finals was more of a curse than a gift. It ended up backfiring for this group because it was proof of concept of, well, this group can work together. And they did have an impressive run to get the 7th seed. They did go on an impressive run to beat Memphis, to beat Golden State, and then to play Denver and have competitive games with Denver. They did get swept, but most of those were competitive. But that then gave them sort of cover moving forward to be like, well, we just need to do a couple tweaks. And even like the 2023 offseason, I think I liked adding Gabe. I thought that he was better offensively than Dennis and a bit more of what they needed. Even Torian for the biannual, it was like, okay, I didn't expect him to be starting. I didn't expect him to be playing, be the starter for 50 plus games or play 30 plus minutes a night for most of the season. But within like a bench role as like a 7th, 8th, 9th man, I was like, Torian at that value, sure, that's fine. Adds another shooter, multi-positional defender. And I do think, for the record, like his defense was solid to start the season. Then it progressively got worse as he was just overtaxed playing 30 plus minutes a night and guarding every opponent's best perimeter player, which was too much for him to handle. But like even that logic I could understand. I think by the 2024 trade deadline, it was clear that group was not good enough. And that's where something should have been done. And that was the famous now, like, oh, well, you can't buy a house, it's not for sale. But then you get to the 2024 offseason and you hype up the 3 picks that you're going to have. And granted, they do get Dalton slipping to them. Maybe if Dalton doesn't slip, they don't like the player at 17 as much, and maybe they end up flipping that. But if you had not traded it by your draft pick time, basically you were going to be picking, making the pick. And once you make the pick, it loses some value because teams just like to have the autonomy to make their own pick. So I think by the 2024 summer, it was pretty clear that this group wasn't good enough. Losing to Denver the way that they lost to them, you referenced the 1-8 record. Having 2 basically mid-40s seasons, and yes, there being some injuries, but injuries kind of being like, I don't think Jared Vanderbilt struggling with injuries is like a surprise. I don't think like Gabe Vincent struggled with injuries last year. He's been relatively healthy this year, but like, Christian Wood, go back to last year, and JHS was injured last year. And so like some of the injuries they've had have kind of been predictable. It's been stuff that guys were dealing with from last season. And I would even argue if it's real that AD's been, and there's no reason to not think it's real, but if AD's really been dealing with this since the end of last season, even before the Olympics, and, the end of, I guess, the regular season going to the playoffs, whatever, you had that. You also had Vando with his offseason procedures, which he had in the beginning of the offseason. Then you also had Christian Wood have his surgery right before the season. That should have been all you needed to know, that this front court was not going to be good enough and that AD was going to potentially have to manage this injury long-term, that Jared Vanderbilt was having 2 surgeries on his feet, excuse me. And that was going to be a concern entering the season. Then Christian Wood is like the last straw of he gets his surgery and that doesn't get addressed. And it just, that baffles me. Separate from the trade cycles, it's like that became a clear need for this group of AD having this foot stuff, Vando being out, Christian Wood being out, and yet they've basically been relying on AD, LeBron, Rui, and Jackson. And that's just not a good enough front court. Like 2 of those guys are great, obviously, but collectively for what you need in 2024 and 2025, that's not a good enough front court. And so I know I just went on a tangent and I know I just ranted, but I do agree with a lot of what you are saying. I think, again, you can kind of isolate each individual trade cycle and come up with a reason why they didn't make a move. But I think by the 2024 deadline, it was clear they needed to make a move. And the fact that they didn't then, and then also didn't in 2024 offseason, it's really just tough to justify why nothing changed. So, yeah. Shabugan, in reality, the season was over the moment LeBron offered to take a pay cut to open a non-taxpayer MLE and they couldn't sign anyone. Yeah. I mean, so the one thing with this that I think was a little complicated at the time was like, if they did sign someone to the non-taxpayer MLE, they were going to be hard capped at the first apron, which, for example, like right now they're about, I want to say like 8.5 million above the first apron. So, and that's with the D'Lo trade where they shed money. So at the time they would have been 11 plus million above the first apron, and they would have had to find a way to trade out of that. So adding an asset to Gabe or to Vando or to Rui to dump those guys somewhere else and shed that additional salary, because you are hard capped there. You cannot go above that. So you would have some time to figure that out, but it would be a limiting factor in terms of how much salary and what the roster would look like. So that is one thing with the non-taxpayer MLE whole thing, just to kind of bring that back, of it wasn't like they would have the exact same roster. They probably would have had to cut, not cut literally, but like find a way to trade a rotation player. And it would have likely have had to have been, I guess I would assume Gabe, because I think they were so high on Rui that I don't think they would have just traded him away. But probably had to have attached a first round pick and maybe a protected pick, because at the time they still had their seconds, because they hadn't done the DFS trade, like a protected first round pick to Gabe to dump him somewhere. And maybe multiple seconds, but then now you can't do the DFS trade the same way. So I will defend that slightly, but in to your point, I think the bigger thing was like they didn't add anyone of consequence this offseason. They could have still traded for people. They still, again, could have still made trades, and they didn't. So either way, I mean, yeah, it's fair. Like I thought Clay would have been a really good fit. I was not as high on the DeRozan fit. Valanciunas, I'm still not high on, and I wouldn't have loved at that price. But especially like Clay, James Harden never was realistic to me. But Clay would have been a really good fit. Yonkler, thank you for the super chat. Can the Lakers get Jordan Clarkson, Walker Kessler, and Lonzo in a trade? I assume you're saying Jordan Clarkson and Walker Kessler there. How much is Clarkson making? I don't know off the top of my head. I think he's in the, yeah. Okay. So he's like mid-teens. Or no, is he? Yeah. He's making 14. So combined salary would be about 17. And then Lonzo's making 20, I want to say. Lonzo's making 21.4. So you got about 38.4. It gets a little dicey. It gets a little tricky. I mean, it's similar to them trying to trade for a De'Aaron Fox or a Brandon Ingram in terms of just getting to that. Like, because Rui and Gabe get you to about 28, 29. And then you still need to get another almost $10 million. And that's pretty tricky unless you're putting max on the table, which I think at that point is an overpay for those three guys. So depending on the picks and stuff, but like technically it's possible. I think for them, something in like the low 30s and below collectively is more realistic. Anything like mid 30s and above, it just gets really hard to salary match. IS, thank you for the super chat. Thoughts on zone with Rui, DFS, and Braun, like it with Vando? Yeah, I mean, I will say I like the smaller lineups better with the three wings. They also went to a small lineup with Rui, Braun, I want to say Dalton, Max and Gabe, or Austin and Gabe, something like that. I don't like that as much. I like at least having a certain level of front court size, even if you are going like quote unquote small. Having a certain level of size overall, I think is important. So I like that trio more than going with two of the three. And I would like it even more with Vando. And I think you go Braun, DFS, Vando. Vando's like technically the center offensively. Defensively, you can guard almost any position. LeBron's the point guard. DFS is off-ball guy, spot up, cutting, screening, etc. And then you could put Austin out there, or you could go like Gabe and Max, Gabe and Dalton, something like that. Max and Dalton, whatever. And I really like that lineup. And zone, like, I think the Lakers need more reps with zone. I think their zone has been pretty hit or miss. It feels like to me that they don't run it that often, and that they kind of like, sometimes it looks like they're kind of unprepared and they're not quite sure what to be doing. And I would say, like, with the zone, that's where some, like, similar to switching, you need to be a little bit more proactive in, like, being able to read the offense and also have a certain level of athleticism and speed and length. And I don't know that they quite have the right personnel to do that effectively, but maybe with another trade or two. Shabugan, again, that you are you and Eeg right now are the two MVPs of the super chats. If the front office doesn't think the team is worth investing in, trade LeBron and AD to situations they can win in and start the rebuild now. Doing nothing is the worst option on the table. Yes. So the way I view it is the Lakers have, and I'm writing about all this in greater depth, but I will just lay it out quickly here. Lakers have three paths, three broad paths forward. Path one is go for it, go all in, put both picks on the table, and make your calls around the league, canvas the league. I mean, they're continually active in canvassing, but make your calls and make your board of, like, here are the guys who are available. Let's rank them 1 to whatever, and let's go get the top 2 guys, top 3, whatever. Probably top 2 is more realistic. I mean, depending on, get at least what are your top 2 or 3, and then, like, basically get the best combination of guys that you can get with those 2 picks. Go all in. Try to build the best supporting cast possible around LeBron and AD. Option 2 is stand pat / do a small move, trade a second, trade 2 seconds, go get your Jonas Valanciunas, go get your Josh Green, go get your whoever that's not really, more of like a bench type player, a smaller bench player that theoretically plugs a hole. You're basically the same roster. You're maybe a little bit better, but you're not dramatically better. And that path to me is the worst path, because you are both not good enough to contend, but you're also giving up future assets. Or even if you're not giving up the future assets, then it's like, what was the point of the DFS trade to begin with? That you might as well have just kept D'Lo, rode out this season, kept your 3 second round picks, and then just saw where you went in the playoffs, probably losing round 1, and that's it. Option 3, path 3, is trade LeBron and AD. Tear it all down, get as many picks and young players as you can get, and start the rebuild. I think option 3 is by far the least likely, if just not entirely off the table, which brings us to option 1 versus option 2. And based on the reporting I've done, the conversations I've had, it seems like option 2 is more likely in terms of either standing pat or making a smaller move. And that to me is the incorrect path. Now, maybe that's a smokescreen. Maybe they are trying to float that out there, or that's just the intel that's out there, and the Lakers are planning a big move and they're investing in it. But to Eag's point earlier, we have now seen them sit out 3 trade cycles. They did make a nice trade for DFS, but they also didn't invest any first round picks. And there's still this question out there of are they really willing to give up a first round pick, let alone both? So we will have an answer in 17 days. But I agree with you in theory. I don't think the Lakers are going to trade LeBron or AD. I think it's the pragmatic thing to do if they're not willing to trade the picks and go all in. But I don't see that happening. Eeg, thank you for the super chat again. Lastly, the Lakers are basically a coin flip in a playoff series with every team in the West except maybe healthy Denver and OKC. They're closer than advertised if the right moves are made. Beyond frustrating. You the GOAT, though. Thank you. I appreciate you. And yeah, I would agree. I mean, I would throw doubt. Like, I had this question on a recent stream. It might have literally been the last one. I don't remember if it was the last one or the one before that. I think the 3 teams that would give them the most problems would be OKC, Dallas, and Denver. Denver is like, a psychological thing at this point where they just kind of have the Lakers number no matter what. OKC, I think, is the best team in the West and arguably the best team in the league. And then Dallas, I think, when healthy, has looked pretty good. And they made the finals last year. I think their pick and roll game, their style of plays is kind of hard for the Lakers to match up with. And with the emergence of Derek Lively, adding PJ Washington, adding Daniel Gafford, I think they have the requisite size that they didn't have in previous matchups against the Lakers. So I would say those are 3 teams I would pick over the Lakers in 7-game series. I mean, the Clippers look pretty good tonight, I'm not going to lie. But you have a lot of questions with Kawhi and his health long-term. James Harden, we know about his playoff history. Beyond that, though, like Memphis, Lakers have matched up really well with Memphis. They have their number. Houston, they've also matched up well with. And like outside of that, for like the second half was really impressive, especially in comparison with that first half. And like, we'll see how those matchups continue to go. But there's like Golden State, Phoenix, Sacramento. I think those are all teams that they could beat. So I'm largely with you. I think there's 3, maybe 4 teams that I think would have a legit shot against the Lakers, or I would pick them. And everyone else, I think it's a 6 or 7 game series, or it's the Lakers winning in like 5. So I'm largely with you. Russell Garrett, thank you for the super chat. All in trade is 2 firsts plus Rui plus 1 player salary dump for Kessler and Sexton, and then also trading for Brown or Alonzo for 2 seconds and a salary dump. It works. So you would have, here's the thing. For Brown or Alonzo in this scenario, it would have to be Gabe and Vando, because Gabe's making 11. Gabe's making 11 and Vando's making just under 11. So you combine those two, and that's 22. Brown's making 23. Lonzo's making 21.4. So with Brown, you got to add in a minimum guy. Lonzo, you're perfectly fine. The issue is Vando's contract. And in just talking to people, there's a sense that for the Lakers to include Vando, they'd probably have to put a first-round pick just as an attachment to Vando. Forget like the other stuff that you're giving up. So you're saying 2 seconds here. So that's the one issue, is that for this to work, like it would actually be 1 first in Rui and a player, and then probably a first to Toronto or Chicago to take on Vando's salary. That is how he's got 3 more years left. He's a player who's offensively limited, has dealt with injuries, and a lot of people view that as a very negative contract. So that's the complicating factor here. HNTR. I almost want to say hater, but it's Hinter, not sure. But thank you for the super chat. I don't know if you saw Crangis's data surrounding percent of organized offense / coverage fit. If so, why have we let it drop off so much? Have you or any media asked JJ? We've asked JJ about the offense a bit. In like, I don't think we've asked him specifically in this, like through the like. I think it's one of those things. It's a little challenging to ask in the sense of like, have you seen Crangis's tweets about the offensive organization, and he calculates it per quarter, and like, what's your response to this data that is his proprietary data that you don't necessarily have unless you guys are tracking it internally, and like, what's your response to this, right? So I know I'm big, I'm stretching it a little bit here, but my point is, like, I've asked about the offensive organization in sort of a more general sense, I guess, and others have as well, and sort of the offensive drop off, and just the balance there of calling sets versus letting them freelance or figure it out on the, kind of them running the show. I do think on some level it is kind of how LeBron, AD, and Austin like to play. And I think those 3 guys, that there's a certain element of that they're all good in isolation, all good with high pick and roll, 2-man game, sometimes 3-man game. And there can be some bad tendencies from previous years that kind of seep in. That, like, I think I would kind of argue, like, this is a trend with the team in almost any category of, you see a certain thing perform well, and then they kind of go away from it. And part of it is on the coaching staff, but I also think part of it's on the players and the night to night focus and consistency. And like that's been an issue for this group. So I think it's fair and it's something to continue to harp on. But I think like referencing that specifically is a little tricky because I don't know if he has those numbers or not. And I like one thing you don't, when you're in our shoes, like it's just always a delicate balance of like how you ask questions, the type of questions you ask. And I think with a guy like JJ, I don't think you want to try and like present it as almost like a gotcha. Like, I have this data that you're not aware of that, like, why aren't you aware of this? Or what's your response to this? Like kind of almost like a gotcha question. Like that's just not how I operate. And I don't think that's how most of us operate. And I'm not saying that you're necessarily saying that, but I think there's a way to present it in a more general sense. And I think we've tried to do that, but I think we could be more direct with it, to your point. And it is something that's a fair question. Yonkler, do Lakers have any interest in Zoe or Clarkson? I have heard Lonzo mentioned as someone who's been linked to them, and I have reported on that. Clarkson has not been a name I have heard. It's been more Sexton and Kessler from the Utah side. James Smith, thank you for the super chat. If LeBron was younger, I would trade AD for high-level role players, knockdown shooters, and proven defenders / center. If LeBron was younger, the Lakers would be in a completely different situation. AD's 31, so you would have a longer runway of this, and I would think in that case you could be a little bit more selective of trading assets and going all in and all that stuff. But like I think you're kind of bringing up almost kind of the Dallas model, and of course they have Kyrie, like the Dallas / Houston model with Prime Harden of. You have your primary ball handler and you surround them with shooters and roll and cut and roll and dive bigs, and bigs that are athletic can be lob threats, protect the rim. I would argue AD can do a lot of those things, but LeBron isn't at that level of like prime Harden, prime Luka now in terms of being that like every possession creator the way that he used to be. I mean, of course, no one's done that part of the game better than LeBron. But at age 40, year 22, it's kind of hard to ask that of him. So I mean, I think high level here is carrying a lot because about this like hypothetical, just because I would say AD still has a lot of value. So you could get some like really elite shooters but we saw AD and LeBron win a championship. So I don't even know that you would have to trade AD. I think that they're, it's still just it's honestly to me just getting better two-way players around them. And it's hard to do. But I mean, yeah, I think if LeBron was younger, he'd be able to carry a lot of these lineups, and like Lakers would just be better by having a younger LeBron. Harry Chinani, thank you for the super chat. I had high hopes for AD this season to prove that he's a top 5 player, but he's not even top 15 anymore. He has the mentality he has to have the mentality every night to dominate the game. Too many mid-range jumpers today. Yeah, I mean, he did. I want to see his shot chart quickly just to know how many of those he made. So, okay. In the paint, he went 2 for 7. In the mid-range, he went 3 for 5, and then he missed his lone 3. So he actually shot well in the mid-range. If you include some of those paint shots that were a little further out, he does miss some of those. But yeah, I mean, to your point, like I thought Zubac outplayed him. I thought Zubac dominated the paint. He blocked him, I think, once or twice. And Now, I will say I still think AD is a top 15. I still think he's a top 10 player. I think earlier in the season, you could have made the argument he was a top 5 guy and probably like number 5. I don't think that anymore, but I still comfortably have him at like number 7 or number 8. Like every player has some level of inconsistency. I think sometimes with AD. Now, what I think, to be honest, actually, I think that the most concerning part of his game recently has been the defensive end and the slippage on that end. And he's had some good stretch or, great stretches. And I think he does give you a baseline level of just like good defense. But tonight with Zubac, with Norm Powell, they were like finishing over 80 at the rim pretty easily. And that's not something we're accustomed to. So I think that's the thing I'm maybe most concerned by with him. And maybe the sign most of all that his foot is bothering him. Eeg, another one. I appreciate the super chat. Done raging, LOL, but random idea. I'd love a collab with an NFL guy that details coaches' importance in each. People need to leave JJ the F alone. NFL coaches and coordinators have multiples more influence on outcomes than NBA coaches. That's interesting. I am friends with David Lombardi, who is the Niners beat writer. He used to cover it for The Athletic, and now I think he's at the San Francisco Standard. And he has a YouTube channel, big YouTube channel. So maybe he'd be someone that would be good now that his off season is upon him. I don't know if he's on vacation or what he's doing now, but it's not a bad idea to hit him up. Okay, getting back into the chat. Madison says AD is a borderline top 10 player. LeBron is a borderline top 15 player, and that's being generous. I agree with both. I do think AD is in the top 10. I think LeBron is, I probably would put him at 14th or 15th, but I mean, I guess by definition, that's a borderline top 15 guy. But the floor with both guys is certainly lower than in previous seasons. And that's partly due to age, due to health, and also I think due to workload and like what's being asked of them. Michael D with the super chat. Thank you. To me, this Clippers group is like the Heat of the past few years. If you can beat them, you're good enough to go all the way. If not, then you will get exposed as pretenders. One game, but still very telling. Yeah, I mean, I think that the Clippers are like this version of, like, this is a different version of Zubac and a different version of Norm Powell. They're both arguably playing the best basketball of their career. Harden is still good in that facilitator, creator role. Like he's not the Harden of Houston or Brooklyn or even Philly, but he's still a good player. And then you have Kawhi, who I thought looked, I mean, he was out of minutes. I mean, that's the other thing that I didn't even really touch on. And I tried not to touch on too much from the game. Like I didn't really mention any of the numbers, but one thing I will mention is Kawhi was on a minutes limit tonight. He only played 24 minutes. He played 16 in the first half, 8 in the second half. And the Clippers still won handedly by double figures with Kawhi only playing 24 minutes. So, I mean, yeah, I think they're just really good on both sides of the ball. And like looking at, like they got, like, again, I think they play the way that JJ would love to play because they got the center in the middle who can protect the rim, score inside, grab rebounds on both sides of the ball. Then they got two like all-star level creators and in Kawhi and James Harden. Then the rest of the group is all wings and guys that can get up and down the floor, attack off the dribble. And then, the one center they play is Mo Bamba. He played 6 minutes, kind of similar to what we've seen from like Jackson and Christian Koloko in certain matchups. So they could go small, they could go big. And I think, like, again, they play pretty much stylistically the way that JJ, I think, wants to play. RK says AD has a bad foot. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing. Like, there's two ways to look at it, right? Like, I think there's an objective way of you can factor in that, like, or acknowledge that the foot compromises him. And I think at the end of the day, like if someone is dealing with an injury, you factor that into your rankings and you factor that into how you evaluate performance. On the other side, I do think there needs to be an element of that when people are just bashing him or hammering him, there needs to be the context of like, he's not fully healthy, and can he float, and can he not be always engaged or not be hustling? Like there was one clip, this was like mind boggling, but one thing I like to do before these streams is the NBA has like the little 10-minute, because there's so many things happening during the game. I'm taking notes, I'm talking to people after the game, we're interviewing the players, and it can be, and also depending on the arena, we're sitting in different vantage points. Some arenas, you can't see part of the court, you can't see the other side of the court. So sometimes we have like fractions of the full picture of the game, depending on where we're sitting. So I like to go back and watch clips and, watch like the 10-minute basically highlights of the game where, you can kind of remember the big plays and remember the sort of different, points of the game. So I went back and there was this play in the third quarter where it's a simple pick and roll with Harden and Zubac, and Max Christie is guarding Harden, AD's guarding Zubac, and they're not switching it. And it's on like the kind of the right side of the floor. And then I think you got two guys in the corner, one guy in the opposite wing, Clippers. And it's LeBron's in the strong side corner. Max wasn't on the ball. It was, who was on the ball? Might have been, I forget. Because Max was actually digging in. I don't remember who was on the ball. And then I think the other guy was Rui. So maybe it was Austin. It might have been Gabe. I don't remember. But whoever's on the ball tries to funnel Harden towards AD in drop. AD, for whatever reason, misreads the screen and like, instead of trying to hustle back into the play, like doesn't really hustle back into the play. Then Max is with the wing shooter and kind of does like a half-hearted dig, but doesn't really dig. Then you have the two low guys, which I believe were Rui and LeBron. And that's more of a LeBron rotation. And then that opens up the swing pass or, the kick out pass to the corner. But someone needed to step up to the ball. And then instead, James Harden goes in for an uncontested left-handed layup. And like the Lakers were stationary, their defense was set. And it was like, I mean, honestly, all five guys made mistakes. Maybe whoever was the point of attack defender technically did his job funneling James Harden towards AD in the screening coverage. The other four guys all botched the assignment. And James Harden waltzes to the rim for an uncontested layup. And like, that was just a simple, like, play that took less than 10 seconds for the Clippers to score on. And that's inexcusable in a game where you're already getting demolished and you're down 20. Letting James Harden waltz to the rim like that is like, so now I just have to say all that to bring in, like, that's a play where I think it starts with really AD making the initial mistake. And granted, he makes the right play 95 out of 100 times defensively, but I think it's hard not to factor in the foot to some extent, and just like that play, maybe not, but yeah. Lawrence Bennett, don't play then. We meant to feel sorry for him. I think there's a balance, right? Because if AD doesn't play, this Lakers season's over. Lakers are like, they could barely beat the Nets without AD. If AD doesn't play, the season's over. I'm not saying you got to feel sorry for him. I'm just saying I think the AD bashing has gone a little far, in my opinion. That's all. Aaron Belton says, if I'm Braun, I'm retiring at the end of the year. I don't think he's retiring at the end of the year. I think he's going to play one more year. But I mean, I don't think this season is necessarily inspiring him to continue to play. Throwing a lies. I don't understand how Gabe's still getting 25 minutes and why he is playing more than DFS does. JJ, not really like him. I think now JJ denied it when I asked him, but I kind of feel like DFS is still dealing with that calf injury that he was dealing with. That's not source. That's just kind of my read on the situation. Now he hadn't played in a couple of days, and I mean a couple games, and maybe that was a factor in like them easing him in. But I agree with you. I think DFS should be playing more than Gabe. I think DFS should be playing more than Rui. Although again, Rui had a good, relatively good game tonight. Okay. So someone said that was AD and Dorian. So then that was Dorian point of attack. Good callback. Leon G, how much better we feel / look if Rob actually got Jonas for the Braun discount. Now, one thing I noted a little bit earlier, I don't know if you caught that, was they would have had to shed salary. It wasn't as simple as like they could have signed him to the contract with Braun taking the discount, but unless LeBron took there was taking the discount to add the player, then there was another element of like another 11 million he might have had to have taken off to get them under the first apron, unless they just salary dump someone. Now, if he was willing to take that much of a pay cut, which would have almost been like a $25 million pay cut to fit both a non-taxpayer MLE guy and them under the first apron, that would have been an absurd amount. And if LeBron was, I don't know if he was going to do all of that. I think it might have just been the amount to get the player on the roster, and then it would have been on Rob in the front office to figure out how do we get under the first apron and shed $11 million, which is not an insignificant amount of money. So that's the one thing with that. That said, is Jonas better than Jackson Hayes? Yes. So, probably would look better, depending on, again, how they figured out that salary dumping. Madison, I think people are extra critical of AD because the media vaulted him on Jokic's level early in the season. I mean, that's fair. I do think, when you have increased expectations or hype, then that can lead to more backlash. I never thought he was on Jokic's level, but I did think you can make a case he was the second best big in the league behind Jokic. But certainly it's been a fall off since the beginning of the season. Pieter K, Jovan, I'm still shocked we're relying on a 40-year-old superstar and an undrafted kid. Shaking my head. I mean, it's wild that LeBron is able to do what he's doing at age 40, and the Austin story, of course, is incredible. I would also say another subplot of this whole situation to me was Lakers could really use Ivica Zubac. It would be really nice if Ivica Zubac was the Lakers starting center the way that he could have and should have been. I see I missed the super chat from Logan Walters. Hey, Jovan, Zoe versus Bruce, both good defensively. I would lean Bruce, but the price for Zoe is probably lower and maybe more realistic. And in that case, I'd be okay with Zoe too. And obviously there's the full circle moment of him coming back to LA. Harry Chinani, tell us more about your experience at the Dome. Is this the future of NBA arenas? Yeah. So, logistically, it's a bit more complicated than the average arena. Now, typically on the road, I don't drive to the arena, so there's the added complication. Like I can't speak to the parking situation at every arena. Here it was like we had assigned parking, which was nice, and it was free, and that was nice. But then you have to take like you got to figure out where this media entrance is, and then it's very overwhelming if it's your first time there. But fortunately, I ran into some media people that I knew, and they helped me figure it all out. Then you take a bridge, and you immediately get to the court where you can shoot outside the Intuit Dome, and they have this jumbotron, like giant NFL sized screen, and it's almost like an amphitheater kind of vibe with the walls on the side coming out. That was pretty cool. Then you go inside, and it's just like a insane arena from like a size perspective. Like it's feels almost like a football stadium, more so than a basketball stadium. And I believe there's 8 levels, which off the top of my head is like MSG is kind of weird because I guess MSG is maybe similar in that sense of like how many levels there are, but most arenas don't have that many levels. And I've been to every arena. I've been to, including all the newer, State Farm Arena with the Hawks, Golden One Center with the Kings, Chase Center with the Warriors. I'm trying to think of what other like brand new. I mean, even Crypto with their renovations, and like this is just at a different level. And like one cool thing that you guys might already know of, but within the concourses, they have the jersey or a jersey from every high school in California, which I think is pretty cool. I don't know if it's Southern California or California. I think it's all California. But yeah, I mean, the media spread was great. A lot of good options. Definitely like the most expansive media spread, I would say, between maybe Detroit is a little bit more, but this one was nicer. I would say like they also had some healthier options, which can be a little tricky on the road. Typically, most media food isn't healthy. So I mean, there was a lot of people there. So I think that also kind of colored my experience in like a negative way in terms of like media, where because it was LA, like both media rooms were completely packed. People were like stealing each other's spots and chairs and like different stuff. But I would say that from the pro perspective, like the wall is cool. I know like fans aren't going to want to hear that, but like it's a well thought out designed arena, and everything is like state of the art, super high tech, like advanced by arena standards. I would say the downside from a media perspective is just like it's a little complicated in terms of navigating. Like you're kind of on 3 separate floors. So it's like the first floor is where the interview rooms are, the second floor is the media rooms, and then the third floors are seats. And I know it sounds like a minor thing, but I've talked about it before on like game nights. We're hustling and bustling like place to place and having to navigate crowds and go up elevators or stairs, and like having to travel that much to get to like all the places you have to get to. It's just kind of adds to the stress. And especially that arena, you walk down a hallway and like you get completely lost. Like they all kind of look very similar. And I know some Laker players actually got lost on the way out, trying to find their cars, because Laker players drove there and parked in the players lot. So they couldn't remember the way to the players parking lot. So like that's how expansive the arena is. And again, everything kind of looks relatively similar. I think maybe they could work a little bit on that, but I mean, otherwise it was really cool. It was like definitely the best NBA arena I've ever been to. And, I know Laker fans don't want to hear Clippers praise, but talking about the arena. Okay, back to the chat. I'm going to go about 5 more minutes here. Gone a little longer than I expected. Hunter, thank you for the super chat. Would you describe Zoe as a big or a small move for Rob, given what he would have had to give it up? Sorry, what he would have given up. How realistic / on the table is it? Same for Kessler. I think So I'll answer the second one first. I think Kessler would be a big move because it's going to require at least a first, if not both. Maybe it's a first and a swap. Maybe it's a swap and removing the top 4 protection with 2027. So I think Kessler qualifies as a big one, as a big move. How realistic it is, I think it's pretty unrealistic at this point. It seems like, I don't know if Utah's just playing hardball or whatever, but their asking price is high, 2 first-round picks. And even then, it seems to be that it's not like an automatic that they're giving him up for that price. Zoe, I wouldn't say it's a small move, especially because I think you're either giving up Rui or you're giving up Gabe and multiple minimum guys, or Gabe and Vando. Then maybe you do have to attach a first. So I would lean more big than small with Zoe. It's kind of more like a medium move to me. I think you could still argue that DFS is arguably the bigger acquisition in that case. So I do kind of lean toward it not moving the needle enough, but as a potential move to solve some of your issues and not necessarily require a first round pick, depending on the outgoing salary, I do like that move. And it is a high upside move. I still think like Kessler is like the white whale there, in terms of just like young player, rookie contract, changes your identity, solves the backup center spot, but can also play next to AD. I think he's a great fit. But Lonzo, kind of an in between, but I would be for it. Like if that ends up being the second move again, it's probably, I wouldn't say they went all in, but they at least did something else, and I think he could fill multiple needs. Johnny Jenkins, outside of Kessler, since it isn't happening, what's your ideal way to reach contender status? I think, as someone mentioned earlier, if you could get Bruce Brown and Robert Williams, I do like that. I guess you could also do Lonzo and Robert Williams. I think if you're going to do smaller moves, ideally it would be 2 players or maybe a 3-team trade where you're getting a couple players. But like basically it comes down to, I think, unless the Lakers are like adding De'Aaron Fox and still keeping Austin or something of that sort, which the Kings are playing much better. Doesn't seem like they're trying to trade De'Aaron Fox anymore. I think that they have to add 2 players of consequence and likely send out Rui and Gabe. And if they bring in the right 2 guys, I think that at least gets them to like puncher's chance contender. And I've said, I don't think there's a move out there that's going to put them on the Boston, OKC, Cleveland tier. But I think there are moves that could get them right there at like number 4, number 5, like maybe pushing with New York. And, could it be, I mean, maybe Cam Johnson's like the one guy that if you just go get him, that's maybe elevating you to a certain level. But it's tricky because, again, I look at a night like tonight and you see the performance and you're like, give them Cam Johnson and Walker Kessler. And I don't know how much that's actually moving the needle with this group because of the defensive limitations, the offensive lack of shot making. Like there's just a lot of the turnover. I mean, really the turnovers are the big thing tonight. 15 turnovers, 5 for LeBron, 5 for Austin. A lot of pocket pass turnovers, like trying to create in windows that weren't there. It was just tough. Madison, 2018 LeBron would make us contenders. 2020 LeBron, 2021 LeBron would make the Lakers contenders. I think from that point on, he slips a little bit, but I mean, yeah. Logan Walters, Pirtle plus Sexton is possible. That would make LA contenders. That's an interesting one. You could also do Pirtle and Bruce Brown. It is a little bit more money. I like those 2 players. Okay, I'm going to get out of here on this one from Harry Chinani. We've reached the halfway point. Sorry, the halfway mark. Predict number of wins. It's been a long day. My reading comprehension is not great right now. And as you guys saw with the intro, I'm a little scatterbrained right now. But okay, so Lakers are on pace to win 45 games with the current record. If you look at the net rating and the point differential, they're actually more like a mid to high 30s team. So actually, I mean, really, if I was being like purely objective on like the data and what we've seen up to game 40, this is a team that's probably going to be under 45 games. And that would put them in the play-in, most likely. Although the West right now obviously is weird because they're the 6th seed technically, and you know, right there above the 7, but also right there below the 5. And I know like literally that, but I'm just saying like how close the West is. Of you could win a game and jump up, you could lose a game, jump down. Like, you know, that's kind of how it is. So to cut to the chase, if I had to make a prediction, man, that's tough. I'll say 47, but I don't feel great about it. And that's more with like the assumption that they make another move at least that helps improve the roster. But again, based on what we've seen through the first 40 games, like this, I mean, so the thing I mentioned earlier, they're 2-7 against teams with a better record than them. But in the West specifically, they're 2-5. And they've still got multiple games against OKC, multiple games against Houston, multiple games against Denver, and multiple games against the Clippers. Memphis is the only one. I think they got one more against them, or maybe they played them 3 times. I don't remember. But the other 4 teams that are above them, I think they have something like a combined 10 to 12 games between those 4 teams. And that could easily be like a 3-7, 3-9, 4-8, 4-7 type stretch, and like really affect them in the standings. So I would say a lot of signs point toward this team being under the 45 games, but I will say I think they make a move, and I think Vando comes back and things start to trend in a more positive direction. It's just like 47 wins would be low for a champion. So like 47 wins, that probably gets you somewhere between probably the 5 or 6 seed. And yeah, but we'll see. But with that, I will wrap. Thank you all so much for watching and listening. Shout out to the late night gang going very late on a Sunday night into Monday. I appreciate your patience with me. Again, I typically write after, but I was collaborating with a colleague. So we wrote before the stream and ended up starting much later and having a bit of a rocky start, kind of like the Lakers, but I feel like this ended up being a pretty good stream. But with all that said, thank you all so much for watching and listening. For those on YouTube, please be sure to hit that subscribe button, turn on channel notifications, and like and comment on this video. For those listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcast platform of choice, please be sure to follow, download, and leave a 5-star review. I'll be back tomorrow / later today with 10 storylines for the Lakers at the 40 game mark. I'll be talking about all of the things that have happened over the past 10 games. So be on the lookout for that new episode of Buha's Block. And I will talk to you in a few hours.